All right, I know a lot of you have been waiting for this one. DIY 8mm film scanner part 3. Finally, there's a lot to cover here, so I've broken it down into sections. The first thing I want to talk about is the raw photography workflow that I use. Most of my work is done in Adobe Lightroom. After Lightroom, I use DaVinci Resolve with the Neat video plugin to export a video with reduced film grain, dirt, and dust. Finally, I want to talk about tethered scanning and why you might want to consider doing it. This is connecting your camera to your computer. I also want to give, if there's time, a full demo, a walkthrough of the entire process, start to finish, so that you can see how it goes. Quick recap from part 2. Here's the raw frames of the Russian footage, before and after being processed through Lightroom. And here's a quick example of the same processed in Lightroom and then with the Neat video plugin applied, reducing film grain and dirt. First up is the raw photography workflow. So within Lightroom, we'll import frames, make adjustments, and finally export a TIFF image sequence. So here's how I do importing in Lightroom. For performance reasons, I recommend that you minimize previews and you add, don't copy, the files. You've got potentially thousands of images, so you don't want Lightroom doing work on all of them. Once you've imported, due to physics, you'll want to select all and flip vertical so that the images are right side up. Now for editing. What I like to do is choose the first frame from the first scene and then use the crop tool to crop the image right around the actual physical frame itself. Then I will crop out the sprocket hole on the left. And then under the Develop tab, hit Auto and see what does Lightroom think of this scene. Once I've hit Auto, I see, wow, Lightroom really has brought down the highlights. So I will go back in and make my own adjustments. And this is where things are kind of fuzzy. You get to decide what you think looks nice. What is the feature of the scene? What's the thing you want to be highlighted? I will also use the white balance tool and select something neutral like clouds to get a reasonable white balance. Once you have your color temperature and your image looking nice, you can select all, hit sync, and then sync your settings across all of the frames you've imported. It's possible you'll see a bottleneck at this point. It could be your CPU, it could be RAM, it could be disk I/O, some combination of or all three. This may take a while. Export frames, also known as coffee time. You'll see why. TIFF is not exactly the most efficient format, but it is the lowest common denominator for other programs to handle. Given that, I recommend that you export TIFF, no compression, 16 bits if you want to be conservative, and 8 bits if you want to save 50% disk space. As far as I can tell, I can see no discernible difference between images at 8-bit and images at 16-bit. This could be over 100 gigabytes of temporary files, so I recommend you put this on an external drive and not your primary SSD. Now I'm going to show you how I created that video from the stills. This is the process of importing frames and exporting video from DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci is a free download, and there is a paid option. In this video, I am using the free version. There's one setting you have to set first, and that is your frame rate. Everything else can change later, but the frame rate really needs to be locked in. 8mm, 16 frames per second. Super 8, 18 frames per second. The next step is to import your media. It's very important that you find the triple dot menu and make sure that Show Individual Frames is turned off. This way, when you drag the clip onto your timeline, it's shown as one movie as opposed to a sequence of frames. Resolve may ask if you want to change the frame rate when you add the clip to your timeline. Assuming you've already set your frame rate, don't change is the correct answer. With the clip on the timeline, I can now sort of scrub through the video, depending on how fast hard drive is. And once I'm happy with it, I go to the Deliver tab, use the default settings, ensure that the frame rate matches, turn off the audio, and then do a quick export. At this point, you're going to be again bound by RAM, CPU, and disk, and it may take some time to render your video. The next thing I do is I use the Neat Video plugin to reduce grain, dust, and scratches from the original scan. Here's a quick comparison of the train video before and after the Neat plugin, and I think you can really see the difference is pretty clear. Neat Video is a paid plugin. There is a demo version available, and it can be quite impressive, so I recommend you do check it out. There is a bit of a learning curve, but it's produced some pretty nice results for me, and I'm definitely not an expert. Once you've installed the Neat Video plugin, you should be able to find it in the Open Effects list in DaVinci Resolve. With your clip selected, go to the Color tab, and once you've added the plugin to the node graph, you can select it and click Prepare Noise Profile. The idea with Neat Video is that you build a noise profile, giving it a sample of what looks like noise, and then it will apply that to the rest of the clip. Neat Video recommends that you choose a large featureless area. The software also has an auto profile mode, which is quite handy. Sometimes the software can't find a nice area, so you can go in and tweak things yourself. I also like to use the flicker, sharpening, and dust and scratch filters. And I found that with Super 8 film, I can generally turn up sharpening fairly aggressively, and things still look pretty good. This is just a quick example of how I look around a scene to try to find a good sample of noise. In the end, I found that a panel on this locomotive actually seemed to be a very good candidate for noise. There was a section that was dark, it was flat, and it looked to have tons of noise in it. So again, here's the before and the after, and the results look pretty good. Here are a few more examples of raw image editing in Lightroom. Here's another Super 8 film scan of the Russia from 1980. Again, I just want to show how big a difference there is, and I think an improvement overall when it comes to pulling details out of the shadows and that sort of thing. This scene is kind of dark, and just by hitting auto, what would Lightroom do? It does already look better. Looks like a pretty well exposed shot, but things are a little grainy in the back. Again, this is the shadows. This is where things are very subjective. You have to sort of decide, well, what's the right blend? What's the right mix here of settings? You want to bring the black clipping down, a little more contrast, but not so dark that it's absolute zero, or you're losing information. You don't want the shadows to be too high so that everything's glowing orange. That's not good either. You want somewhere in between. This is where it's very subjective. So you get to decide. And these are the different levers you can pull. So I go through each and sort of test each region and see what looks like a good balance. And you know, I think this looks pretty good. I think this looks better than the original. It's a little more glowy. Again, there's that sort of saturation. So this is versus the original. So this is the balance. Overall, I do think I prefer the brighter look. This is actually a decently balanced shot straight out of the film. And you can see there's some good amount of dark and highlights and then some stuff in between. So again, well, what does Lightroom do? What does Lightroom think of this? So I'll crop the frame in to just the picture itself, take out the sprocket, and hit auto. And you know, that looks pretty good. Comparing before and after, I like what Lightroom's doing. So you can see a little more being pulled out of the shadows. The folks' faces in the background. There's a little more being brought out of the shadows in the back. The important thing is that you don't want things to be too grainy or too glowy. You don't want too much noise to be coming out when bringing up these details. My take is it's pretty good, but the road looks a little bit glowy in the back. It's kind of greeny yellow. There's a little bit of a color cast on it that I could probably fix later. Maybe I can tweak the highlights, pull the highlights down just a little. This is where it's very subjective. So once I like my adjustments, I can apply them to all the other frames in the current scene. So kind of scrub across this scene and make sure that things look reasonable. And if it looks good, then fairly consistent, then we can apply it to all the frames in this scene. So far, looking pretty good. We'll compare our original versus our changed edits here. That's not too bad. Even if hitting auto, Lightroom doesn't change very much. So overall, I like this. This is good. This might be the only scene in this whole reel where the camera was really still. Whoever shot this was flying around a lot, so I like how this scene turned out. You should note here there's a little bit of dark where there's absolute zero. That blue is underexposure, so you might want to bring up the black clipping a little bit to correct for that. And it's going to lighten everything up a little bit. But again, that's the balance. I'll synchronize all the settings across those frames. And there you go. Okay. This is the long part. Scanning, enhancing, filtering, and exporting video. So I first align the camera with the projector, and I usually run about 3 times magnification. And then it's sort of a delicate dance of shifting camera around, moving the bits, moving the base closer to the projector, back and forth, side to side. It's fiddly. And then eventually I get it to a point where I'm happy. And here I have the camera tethered to the computer. All that means is there's a USB cable that's connecting it. And then I'm running Sony imaging software on the computer. And this basically gives you the video feed and remote control and the ability to adjust things like shutter speed, white balance, and even take pictures. So the benefit is that when I take photos, they now get stored on the computer. The downside is now you have a computer involved in the process. So there's one of the limitations is you might overrun the buffer if you run the projector fast. So I run it at about 1 3/4 frames per second, roughly. So now that I've got film loaded into the projector, I'm going to focus using the rail slider control and looking for the focus highlight on the film itself. And the live video feed there does not show it, but on the camera, you'll see focus highlighting is shown. I chose the color yellow, so you see it there. Okay, so now we're pulling the first few bits of the film through. Things are looking good, lined up. Here's on the computer. So the first scene looks a bit underexposed. So what I'm going to do is make the shutter speed slower by clicking the up arrow. Seems a little counterintuitive, but I think up means brighter, down means more dark. So fairly slow at 1/10 of a second. And you can see there the histogram. This is another nice benefit. What the camera's seeing more or less real time. I don't need to adjust it here, but if I wanted to adjust the frame vertically, use that little control. So to adjust the frame, you turn the little dial on the projector, and while the film is running, you can shift it upward or downward. One thing I haven't yet noticed here is that the film's piling up on the other side. I'll have to fix that. So I want to show here as well on the computer, the viewer application that comes with the Sony stuff eats tons of memory as it's bringing all these images in. I think it's holding them in memory or something. So that the remote viewer will end up using gigabytes of memory. So you're going to want to turn that off. It's nice to look at to make sure you're not getting any streaks in your images. You're not moving the motor too fast. But once things look good, I recommend you turn that viewer off and just let new frames keep coming in. Quickly, this is the physical frame scanner, little OLED display that I put together. And there's a little bit of crap on the display I didn't catch. But this was kind of fun. Uses a separate Arduino. What I was trying to do was have something that would display real-time stats before I started tethering the camera to the computer. So I could calculate frames per second, and then I also had the RPM on the stepper motor, and then the ASCII character with the happy face for when it was running, and then I just turned it upside down for when it's not. So here's where I realized, oops. Yeah, make sure that you put the uptake reel on the projector correctly. And make sure that thing loops around properly the first time. It doesn't always catch. It's supposed to sort of grab the curl of the film and then take it from there. But yeah, it doesn't always work. Another thing I thought I would try, I thought I was being really smart by putting a makeup removal pad in the film path. In retrospect, this was not a good idea because, as you can see here, it's sort of bending the film, altering the path of the film, and that was causing a bit of tension and causing the frame to shift because it was sort of in the way. And so, if anything, what I do recommend doing is you can try putting a pad or similar right before it goes through those little rollers. That seems to work better. So here's just a little sped up sequence, and I found some dust and dirt, and so I would stop the scan, open the film gate, like hit the rewind button to release the film gate, and then use a little air blower to blow some of the dust and dirt out there. You do see the occasional streak, and sometimes that's not how the picture actually looks, but sometimes you'll get what looks like a moving frame. And you can make sure that those aren't coming through on the actual viewer or check the actual files, but you will see those sometimes. Otherwise, everything works really well. The other thing that I should mention, for new scenes, if I go between an indoor scene and then suddenly an outdoor scene, I will stop and adjust the shutter speed so more light comes in so that I get a better exposure for the lower light. Well, it's been almost 20 minutes, and if you're still watching, I've got almost an hour left if you really want to dig into the details. For the next section, I'm going to do a detailed walkthrough, the whole start to finish process of importing images, doing enhancements, exporting from Lightroom, going into DaVinci Resolve, creating the movie, doing some grain, dirt, and dust reduction, and finally exporting a 4K video. So if you've made it this far, you're probably going to be interested in the rest. I hope you find it interesting, hopefully a little fun, and I hope that it's useful for you if you're doing this kind of work as well. Here's Adobe Lightroom. So we've got our frames imported, and I'm going to show you an example of some of the things I've scanned. I scanned a little bit through the intro, rewound the film, and then made some adjustments and started scanning through the film. So the first thing you'll notice is, hey, everything's upside down. What's going on? Well, it's the way projectors work. So to fix this, go back to the Library tab, select all, and then flip vertical. So what I like to do, though, is I like to leave the lead-in frames as is, and then shift-click all the way to the end, only excluding the lead-in frames, and then photo, flip vertical. That might take a moment. And then you'll have your images right side up. So then, once all the images are flipped, I look for the first frame from the first scene. And at first I thought, did I misalign the frame? What's going on here? This scene looks like it's cut off, and then I realized, oh, no. The person's in the streetcar, and what they're seeing there is just part of the inside. They're looking outside. So further down we see, okay, that's more full frame. So the next thing I think I want to do is to start cropping. So here I have underexposure sort of enabled. So everything that's blue is complete black, 0. And in fact, it's clipping. So it's dark, absolute 0. So I could start by hitting auto and see, what would Lightroom do? But here we see that it's really removing a lot of the contrast, but it's also taking the whole frame into consideration. I don't care about the outside frame. I don't care about the light coming in from the side. So what I do care about is the immediate area around the frame. And with this film, I'm pretty sure that the exposure goes right to the edge of the frame, including the sprocket hole. So I think I want to leave the sprocket hole in and then give a little bit of room around, because the film might shift as it goes through the scanner. So once I have my crop, just for fun, hit auto again. What does Lightroom think? Wow. So it really has brought down the highlights, and it seems to be including that light from the sprocket hole. So that's not great. So here's, to get around that, we'll crop the sprocket hole out. Hit done. This is the image we care about. So now hit auto again. See what Lightroom does. Highlights have still been dragged way down. I want to preserve but not blow out highlights. So I like to reset them and then bring it back down, but not too far down. This again is where it's subjective. This may not be a great scene to use as a reference, so I think I'm actually going to back out of this entirely. Maybe choose a different frame from a different scene. But regardless, the first thing I want to do before anything else is crop all frames. To do this in a more optimal way, I recommend you select all and only apply the crop. So check none in the dialog. Include process version and only crop, and then synchronize. I don't believe I've done any straightening or aspect ratio changes, but you can leave those in. And then depending on how fast your computer is, this may take some time, but there's a good amount of processing and I/O going on. Once that's finished, things should be pretty zippy. So once I've done my first crop, I like to sort of scrub through the video and do a little spot check. Did the frame shift through scenes? It looks like it's still reasonable. The film itself hasn't really shifted. This is good. Camera didn't move. Things didn't really shift. Might be a little bit of, you can see a couple pixels off the top. You could even do that in post if you want. Later, from editing from DaVinci, I mean. But yeah, pretty happy with how this is looking. You could even adjust the crop per scene if you wanted. But I think this is looking pretty good. I like how these ones are looking with the rail car here. Maybe not the best example. This one may be a bit better. I think I'm just going to leave these little bits in. It's okay to have a little bit of overlap in your scan, I think. So, yeah, let's roll with it. So after my crop, usually the next thing I like to do is to go choose something from the first scene. So I'll try to scrub through the first scene and find a reasonable candidate for adjustment. There does seem to be a bit of a color shift going on as I'm scrubbing through frames. And I think the reason is I had the wrong color temperature or tint settings, which I will fix. So let's try to fix that. In fact, we'll push W for a white balance. Try to base it on something neutral like cloud. Cloud should be white. And again, this is very subjective. But you know that clouds are generally white, skies are generally blue. Does this scene look nice? Does it look better than before? I think that the warm tones in the gravel, the ground, the foliage looks pretty good. But with this, at the temperature of 4,000, everything's kind of blue. 6,000 seems a little bit high, so maybe 5,000, something in between. Maybe reasonable. I'm not a colorist or anything. But I hit auto again just to see what would Lightroom do. This is warmed up a fair bit. It's looking better. Maybe still a little bit warm. And still a fair bit of blue in the picture. So maybe I stick with this for now and then apply this to this scene. Just this particular scene. And then see how the rest of it looks. One thing to note is the gear, the sprocket hole at the left is looking a little bit yellow, and that might suggest that there's a bit of a mismatch between the light that I'm using, the LED, and then the film. So what I like to do is select only active photo, scroll back in time to the beginning of the scene, hold shift, click. Now I've set my range, and I want to make sure, check everything, apply all those settings to the current scene. Quite fast now. So I'm noticing again the sprocket hole is kind of yellow, and sometimes not a problem. It might be though that there's a, like I said, a mismatch between my cool white LEDs that are the light source versus the film being indoor type, or some sort of mismatch between light sources. I think the colors are a little off in this scene, and that's why that sprocket hole's looking a little funny now that I've adjusted it. So here's the next scene. Again, everything's really blue. So I do think I want to correct that. I'm going to look for something a little bit more out in the open. Sky should generally be blue. Buildings are generally going to be gray. So we'll try to set this as a white point. That's looking better. Again, very subjective. You get to choose. This is your call. Once again, auto. What would Lightroom do? How does it look? And then it's worth also cropping in and then hitting auto just to see if there's a difference once Lightroom is excluding the sprocket hole. It's looking pretty good. Highlights have been brought way down, which I would recommend you do adjust. Try adjusting things even after hitting auto in Lightroom. So I do see there's a reason that highlights have been brought down, but you don't want to bring them too far down. Yeah. I tend to bring highlights down and then sometimes push the shadows up equal amount in the opposite direction. But if you bring the shadows up way too high, you're going to start seeing a lot of noise especially in the dark, like in those buildings on the left. So maybe highlights down 45, shadows up above 45, a good contrast, and then the whites, pulling up the white clipping, add sort of more contrast. Yeah, again, it's all very subjective. I forgot to adjust the crop after my edit, so thankfully this is easy. Still have my selections, so make the crop change, sync, done. You know, this might actually be a better scene for Lightroom to adjust because it's got a good balance of foreground and background and sky and land. Does that look better than before? So again, very subjective. This does look a little bit noisy with Lightroom bringing it up almost 1 on the exposure and then dragging highlights down. You're seeing some real noise in the shadows in the background. So I think I'm just going to leave it as previously. And remember, just for context, for contrast, if you compare with the original, I think it's been improved. I think there's a reasonable improvement. Even if the colors are a little warm, this is all an inexact science. Another thing, if that's supposed to be black in the background, they're getting a little bit, things are looking a little blue. So, see there's a lot of noise. So, again, a fine balance. So this is another scene. And I want to call this one out because we hit auto. And wow, the auto, what would Lightroom do? It definitely looks, it's trying to preserve the sky. So it's dragging the highlights way down and everything looks very blue. So this is not good. So if I reset the highlights, wow, it was really bright. So again, you have to pull things down, but not too far. And then maybe you just need to tinker with the settings a bit yourself. There's a really strong blue cast here. You don't want the darks to be too dark. You don't want to be clipping. So there's a little blue arrow on the top left when you're doing adjusting black clipping. When something is going so dark that it's going all the way to 0, you're losing information. So you don't need to pull everything too far down, but you don't want to bring everything up too light either. So there's a happy balance. Similar on highlights, there's a point where things will clip. Everyone knows what a sky looks like, so I try to think, well, we don't want it to look like day at night or night and day. So there's a happy medium again. I find that the histogram is really helpful while you're doing this sort of work. So here's a previous frame that I worked on. It's kind of like those cooking shows, like, here's one I've already prepared. Sorry. So everything looks really blue in this frame, and I think I did a color correction. So forgive me. That might be color grading. We'll get into that later. So it looks like color temperature and tint played a role in this one. So you're looking at trees, how are the shadows? This is where you can try to pull shadows up. But then you really start to see noise in the frame. There's not too much to recover in terms of details, so you might as well leave those shadows mostly where they are. You don't want to bring things down too much, but you don't want to be just seeing noise at the same time. So again, we'll pull the highlights down, push the shadows up in roughly the same strength, if you will, in opposing directions. There's definitely some noise, so trade-offs. You can try bringing up the whole exposure, but then it's difficult. I think this is decent. I'm going to run with this, so it'll sync to the entire scene. I'm just going to... Oh, and I need to, don't forget, adjust crop. So if the picture does extend across the full frame, then we have it as well. So now I'm seeing this might be the feature, right? So in terms of exposure and adjustments and corrections, maybe what I should do is adjust for this as my target. Star of the show here. However, things are already looking pretty good. That histogram looks pretty nice. Good distribution between shadows and highlights. So, again, what would Lightroom do, right? Auto? I think what I had looks pretty good. Sometimes you'll look at a scene and think, you know, this looks a little bit warm. There's a yellow-orange tint on it, so you want to adjust the color a little bit. So sometimes, if the colors aren't quite right, you can go... Adobe Lightroom 10, I think, has introduced a color grading wheel or tool. And so whatever color you want to move away from, yellow, orange, red, you pull away into the opposite. So in this case, blue. And keep going downward until you feel like you've made a correction somewhere in the middle without making everything else too blue. So the body of the car is looking closer to white. Still not perfect, but a little bit cooler overall. So the original is a little too warm, so we want to sort of cool out the scene. Note that there's already a good amount of blue in here, so you want to be careful about clipping. So maybe you adjust the black clipping a little bit, because we're clipping now. So bring up black. I'll show you that in detail. So you see the triangle, and then you bring down the black clipping, and now it's active, indicating, okay, we're going too dark. You're losing information. So you bring up the black clipping a little bit. So you want things as dark as possible, but not absolute zero. So then when we adjust, I want a little warm, but I don't want things to look like just blue. Once you have your settings, you can hit synchronize. You could apply only the color wheel changes. Note again that I forgot to, what did I do, right? I forgot to adjust my crop. So I'm going to have to go back and fix that. I'll show that later. Here's another scene. It's not very interesting. Seem to be going by some bushes. And then the next scene is we're inside the rail car. Or inside the streetcar. And it's very clear right away that the color is not right. I carried over my settings from the previous scene. So, wow, that's really off. Not to mention, only that, exposure's way off. So we're now kind of indoors, and the exposure is off, and the colors are probably off. So this is going to be a tough one. So again, auto, what would Lightroom do? It's dark. Lightroom's going to struggle with this. So again, we'll crop out, crop in. Let's poke around the frame. Well, if we set white balance, maybe we can go with what looks like a roughly neutral thing. but now we'd look stronger in the blue. Blue, green. If we reset, that's kind of what came out of the scanner, so not great. Not really loving this. At auto, bring things further up. What if we just bring the highlights to 0? Wow, it's really bright. Not great. I would say pretty bad. So if we drop the shadows now, wow, good example of how everything in the foreground is being underexposed. Perhaps I could have scanned this at a slower shutter speed and brought more light in, but then I'd be blowing out the foreground there, the distance. So now we bring up the exposure. We can really push and bring things, shadows out of the details. But, whoa, there's certainly a lot of noise in this. Tons of noise. So what might a happy medium look like? Around +3? That's, oh man, I wouldn't go beyond maybe 2.5, 3. So let's push it here and just see. Now I'll bring up the shadows. Ooh, looking pretty noisy. And then we can bring down black clipping. Try not to go too dark. See if we can recover the highlights from the outside. So, with a blast of sun coming in there. This is a tough shot. I think this is maybe the best I can do. Is bring the shadows up. It's interesting how even bringing the shadows up at this point is affecting the outside. You could also try killing the highlights, but even then tough shot. So we'll adjust black clipping so that we're not actually clipping out entirely. We're going to lose a bit of information there. But then there may not be much in the whole scene anyways. This might be the best we can do for the interior. We can try adjusting the white balance. That's still a bit off. Greenish on the lights, that's not quite right. If I try targeting that, we end up just kind of pinkish. That's not right either. Maybe this beam here. Just gonna run with this. And then, oh, I forgot to remove my color grading from earlier. Let's reset that. Let's see if we, let's just try moving the colors around a little bit. Not loving this. Everything's kind of green. I'm just going to leave this as is. We'll roll with this. And we'll see how the rest of it looks. Crop out again. Fast forward to the end of this scene. Just again to show difference before and after. Before, after. Before, after. And maybe it's better we leave this, but I think this is much more interesting than having the foreground completely dark. So once you have everything cropped and adjusted and happy with how all the scenes are looking, next part's kind of the fun part, which also takes a while, where you select all and export a series of TIFF images, an image sequence. So I have DSC 0001 all the way to DSC 3905. That's a lot of images. So that's the entire film. It's a 3-minute, roughly, Super 8 film. I haven't found sort of the perfect format that is fast to export, efficient, file space, time to export. So I choose to export TIFF. I've experimented with a couple different presets. So if I'm targeting, say, 4K, I want 2160 on the short edge. So I've got 2632. Tell Lightroom to resize to 2160. But then there's a trade-off here. So if I'm resizing, there may be some sharpening applied. I don't think I want to do that. I'm going to eat the disk space. Each image is going to be bigger, but I've got lots of disk space. I also can't tell. I don't know if there's a difference between 8 bits and 16 bits here. I personally have not been able to tell the difference. This may be because I may also be shooting compressed RAW on the Sony camera. So that may affect the number of bits that it records in. I think most cameras do somewhere between 8, 10, 12, 14 bits when they shoot RAW. So this may be worth reviewing. So I'm going to actually try this here. We'll do a test from these images that I've shot. You can take a look and see, is there a difference between exporting an 8-bit and a 16-bit? So here, go export. We're going to do that. Just regular TIFF. Going to do 16-bit. Do not resize. No sharpening. Export. New folder. 60 megabytes for that single image. That's a big picture. Okay, export again. 8-bit. No compression. Same otherwise. We're going to use unique names. So we'll have 1 and 2. Half the size. And how do they look? Maybe I could use an image comparison tool comparing actual bits. Let's just give these a look here. If there's a big difference, I'm not seeing it. See that I'm switching between the two? They look identical to me. Which means to me, for this kind of stuff, I think you're fine using exporting 8-bit. Even zoomed in here, not seeing it. So I'm going to select all, export 8-bit TIFF, no resizing, no sharpening, no compression. I'm going to put this on a 16 terabyte drive and then go get coffee. So at this point, we're exporting almost 4,000 still TIFF images. So now is a great time to go for a walk, get outside, lunch, coffee, maybe go for a long walk because this may take a while. So depending on your computer, you may light up your CPU, RAM, hard drive. I do believe that it's CPU heavy, this stuff. So yeah, I've got a 6-core IC7 and I'm using, according to Activity Monitor, over 900% CPU exporting TIFFs, just about 1,000. So yeah, it's pretty funny. And then occasional spike on the disk, reading and writing those images. So I think for me, the real bottleneck here is the CPU. I don't have a fancy GPU or anything, so I'm going to go get lunch. And then just for fun, you can, when this work finishes, you can look at the timestamp of your files and see how long it actually takes. So now we're back. 1 hour to export just about 4,000 images, which that's maybe not too bad, actually. So that's 8-bit, 30 megabytes each. Those are big files. The raw source stuff was 72 gigs or 73 gigs, and I ended up exporting 118. So not too bad. Still, there's some inefficiency there. So the next step is to go into DaVinci, where you'll import the frames, do the filtering and the export. Before anything else, most important thing, again, change your frame rate for the project. So if you don't, and you import your media, it's going to be brought in at the wrong frame rate. It's difficult to change after the fact. So trust me. Super 8 film, 18 frames a second. So that's what I'm going to do. Set my frame rate. Now I'm going to import my media. Go to media, media storage, find the folder, and make sure show individual frames is off. This is very important. Before you go into that folder, turn that thing off, because then it makes the difference between showing all images versus a sequence. So now we have a clip. If I were to turn this on, it would show all the files, and it might actually crash or something because it's going to be going through that 100 gigs. So now we have a clip, which is great. Movie, just what you want. So now I go into the edit tab on the timeline, drag the clip onto the timeline. You might be tempted to try to play back your video, but unless you have a super fast computer and a really fast hard drive, that's probably not going to happen. So you're going to be doing something like 500 megabytes per second data rate for this video. Never mind the cost of decoding the images. So unfortunately, you're just going to have to do an export to see the video in real time. So that's what I like to do. The first thing is I like to scrub through the video and just see, how do things look? Did I miss anything? Things are looking pretty consistent here. Lighting is pretty good. Frame's okay. Color's pretty good. This is not bad. Although you might have noticed I missed something. So now I want to export the entire video. I like to push I for in and O for out to sort of mark my in-out points. And then you can choose to render in-out range or entire timeline. Maybe simple just to keep entire timeline. As far as options, uncheck audio because there's no audio. QuickTime H.264. First render, you could just do HD. Make sure your frame rate is matching 18. Auto quality, it's going to be a big file, but it's going to look good. Leave everything else pretty much standard. Set your location, somewhere you got lots of space. Add to queue, hit render. And then the limiting factors here are same as before. I/O, right? How fast your drive is, how fast your CPU can work, if you have a GPU, if you get hardware accelerated rendering. I think the free version on the Mac has H.264, accelerated H.264 encoding, so that's nice. I think on Windows you have to be on the paid version. So I've watched the video I exported, and whoops, I realized I missed something. As I mentioned, there's a scene where scrubbing through, I missed the cropping. I cropped out the sprocket hole. And this is okay, so I can fix this easily. So I go back into Lightroom, edit the source images, overwrite the files, and then re-export the video. And there you go. So that's your source. As long as you update your source images, everything else carries through. It's very nice. So you've exported your video now at 4K, and it looks good. But the next thing you may want to do is try to remove some of the film grain, dust, dirt, scratches, that sort of thing, and process this video. So now you have your movie. It's looking good at 4K, but you haven't really done any processing on it. So the next step is to use some filters, plugins, processing, that sort of thing, to the frames to tidy up the video. So this is things like reducing the film grain, dust, dirt, scratches. There are a few different bits of software that do this. With DaVinci, as far as I know, there's no free way to do this. So I've chosen to pay for a plugin called Neat Video, which I've found to be pretty impressive. And if you do enough of these films, I do think it's worth the $100-some investment to do. And there's a demo version you can try out as well. So what I do is, with your clip selected, you go into the color tab, and then in the top, there's a clip, and then the right of that is a node graph. It's just showing kind of the input, the output from the source to the destination. And what I like to do is drag through to a scene where there's kind of a lot going on, dark and light and foreground and background. And then in Open Effects Library, I've installed the Neat Video plugin, which here is called Reduce Noise, current version 5. Click, drag, put it in the line. You connect it. Now it's in the path for processing. So click Reduce Noise V5, and then click Prepare Noise Profile. Now, for some reason, this took an ice age, so we're just going to wait. Okay, I've got 32 gigs of RAM on this machine, and Resolve is, for some reason, eating all of it. I think it must be loading the entire clip or trying to load the clip into memory or something. This has not happened before. I just want to call it out. Maybe if I'd split this clip into separate clips, like per scene, I might work around this, but just mentioning 40 gigs of RAM, that's wild. So now we're in the Neat Video plugin. This UI is there's a bit of a learning curve. So I'm going to just go through what I know. There are forums and online guides and things. But if you're like me, you've never used it, the best place is Auto Profile to get started. Automatically build a device noise profile using the most noisy video frame. So if you click this, it will go through this range here and try to find the one with the most noise. And try to choose an area to sample, which it will then apply to the rest of the clip. Noise is defined here as a pattern repeated within a detail that doesn't have any, and within an area that doesn't have features. So if I were to try to choose a car, it's going to say, this is not uniform. There's a window, tire, different things. If I were to choose something like pavement, it's going to say a little better. It's a uniform pattern in a featureless area, but you also want to have a larger area. You need a better sample. So one of the best things to do is to look for a big open space. Maybe a sky, maybe some pavement, maybe something that's really in the dark. But don't choose the cloud. Choose the sky. Software seems to be going for the sky in this frame. So that seems to be reasonable with a decent noise level. And according to the quality on the right, that seems to be pretty good. So this whole thing is kind of fuzzy, but you have to go with what the software says. Forgot to mention you want a progressive video scan, type, and also a gamma corrected input. Linear will be very light, so you want things to be gamma corrected. So we'll do another quick auto profile here. From here, I can do a profile check, which basically just shows you how slow your computer is. And this work takes a long time. So I can do a check, and it gives you kind of a preview. And you can push spacebar, and I think you can click and drag around in the scene at this point, and you can see before and after. What I'm seeing here is things look kind of soft, though. Bit of a loss of detail. We haven't yet done other options, including sharpening, so we're to go to the Adjust and Preview tab. Once you've made your selection, you can apply a few more tools. I don't touch the radius, but I do use flicker and dust and scratches. I don't think there's much flickering in this film, but it seems just like a nice thing to turn on. Dust and scratches is a big one, and it just magically works most of the time. But I do think sometimes it can cause some sort of digital glitches. So I do like to turn it on and then review and see if it introduces any real weird sort of artifacts in high motion. The temporal filter allows you to define the range in the frames that the software looks at to sample. Bigger radius takes more time, but the idea is that you have better quality. I don't touch the luminance or noise level. Sharpening is where I kind of go to town, so I do apply a lot of fine medium sharpening. So it seems like we've lost some detail in this particular video with this particular sample. So I turn the sharpening way up and then watch what it does to the frame. So turn up the medium, turn up the large. Does it make much of a difference? I think so. And again, this is all very subjective. So you have to look and make a call. Does it look better with or without? And then maybe you want to adjust, bring large down a little bit. So yeah, I can hover and get a little bit more detail. From what I'm finding with film, with Super 8, I think I've turned up everything usually 200 plus, and it's generally been okay. There's a little bit of a glitch on the tire, on the front tire of that car, but otherwise I'm not seeing too much loss. Take a look at the sign. Things are looking pretty consistent. Trees and power lines are still being retained, I think. So once you feel like you have your settings, there's a play all, which will sort of rotate between back and forth across a little frame range. So you can get an idea of what the final thing will look like. And this is rendering right now, one frame at a time, as fast as my computer can do. So yeah, you're going to be waiting a while for this to process. You could probably spend a lot of time going back and forth in the details. There's also another profile option here. So I've got 6 physical cores and not a fancy GPU at all. And so yeah, I'm doing less than 1 frame per second. I mean, yeah, wow. Hurry up and wait. Yeah. So let's say I'm gone through and I say this is good. I'm happy with the profile. I'm happy with the before and after. Hit apply. And it will now apply this to the entire clip. But let's say I'm like, I want to poke around a little bit more. What happens if I choose over here? Oh, so apparently there's 13% less noise over there compared to the sky. If I try to choose my own, -4. What if I try over here? Again, -4, smaller area. So maybe this is not the best scene even to use for picking noise. So what if I were to try, the road? Oh, well, that looks good. Very noisy, but it's a small area. I find that hard to believe. But what if I go check somewhere else? What if I compare? What did we lose? What did we gain in this? So that's looking pretty good as well. So again, all very subjective. This is part of the challenge. I might try a different scene where there's a visible, a larger piece of road to work with as sample material, and then apply that to the entire film. So sometimes you just have to trust the software, though. So I'm going to go with the software on this one. So I'll hit apply. Now this filter is going to be applied to the clip. So you definitely will not be able to play this back in real time. It's going to be slower to play, slower to render, slower to scrub. Even scrubbing through the video is going to be pretty much impossible at this point. You can click and see individual frames, but even on my computer, this is still very slow. But at least it can give you a bit of a preview of what you're going to see. I also recommend that you turn off OpenEffects render caching, I believe it is. I think by default on the clips, the rendering is set to auto. When you're applying this very expensive filter, I say right click and turn that OpenEffects rendering off. So it's not trying to pre-render anything because it's just way too expensive. So it's worth noting that I have applied one sampling to the entire clip. Perhaps there's a chance. There's a scene that has better grain, a better place to sample, or maybe you're scanning a reel that's put together with different films. So what I recommend is if you want to be really particular, you can split the film per scene, cut the video into separate clips, and then apply the filter to each one individually. It's more work, but then maybe you're going to capture or reduce noise and that better per scene. So it depends on how much time you want to spend on this. And with rendering being so slow, this is going to take hours to export at 4K. Congratulations. You made it all the way through. Okay. This has been a big project. I still have more to do, but I've been taking notes. And I don't know if you can see that. I've got numerous pages of handwritten notes throughout the process of working on this. And it's been a lot of fun. Only occasionally frustrating. I've gotten some pretty good results. I'm pretty happy with how this project has turned out. Learned a lot along the way. Had some great feedback. Thank you so much to everyone who's watched, left comments, some great discussions, some good ideas. It's been great. I still have a few things I want to cover. I'd still like to go into some of the electronics in detail. I still have yet to update my Arduino stuff. You know how I said in the last, you know how sometimes you get something working and then you just, that's good enough. Yeah. That's still the case. I still haven't rewired the Arduinos. So I plan to get some, I think I'll have to do a part 4, follow up, maybe some Q&A, and also talk a little bit about schematics and how I did the electronic stuff. I think folks will find that helpful. One person mentioned they got a Canon S400 projector, same that I've been using, and they found that the film gate wasn't as large as the one that I have for whatever reason, and they don't see the sprocket holes when the film's going through. And I'm assuming that they removed the back plate, and I think they cleared it out entirely. It's the metal frame, the metal piece, the actual gate itself. It might be that it's not as wide. It's really interesting just to think, because the fork comes in and pulls the film down, so it must be that the fork is coming in, but it's not going far enough into the metal. Anyways, just something to consider if you're getting an S400 You might have to bore out the film gate a bit if you want to expose the sprockets. Something to think about. There's another question here which I think maybe one person's mentioned, and that is, why not just use DaVinci Resolve for the entire process? Because once you have the raw frames, kind of like you're making a video, why not do all the processing work in DaVinci and then export the video from there? That's a good question. I come from using Lightroom. I've been using Lightroom since the late 2000s. And so I've been using Lightroom for over a decade. So my experience, familiarity with those tools, is the reason that I'm taking photos and then images, if you will, and then using photo editing software to do the core of my work, and then bringing the frames into DaVinci and then exporting a video from there. But I do think it's entirely possible you could import, if you want to keep the raw format. I don't think DaVinci can import Canon CR2 or Sony ARW files by itself. And I could be wrong, but I do know that they will import DNG, digital negative, and you could easily convert your Canon or Sony RAW into DNG and then import the RAW into DaVinci and then work with those raw frames entirely from there. So if I do part 4, I actually might have to try that out for myself and see how it goes. One other person said, I think it was Super 8 Rescue on YouTube, great username, noting a bit of film that I had where the magenta, again, it was showing red, and I think they call it a cyan failure. It's an interesting term. And so they said in DaVinci, as long as you reset your black levels, you can then basically pull the reds down, and that's how you can correct, or at least offset that color failure. I've had similar results in Lightroom using the color grading tool, like I showed, to sort of pull away from the red to help correct. That's another way to do it. Okay, I think I've blabbered on enough. It's already been over an hour. Thank you so much for watching this series. Thanks for watching so far. Thanks for the participation and comments and feedback and ideas and everything. It's been fun. I hope you've enjoyed this and that it's been entertaining and informational at the same time. See you in the next video.